Today, the small town of Antelope in northern Oregon is one of many tiny settlements across the United States that may well disappear over the coming decades. With the city's population dipping below 50 and precious little hope of further growth, Antelope is a fading light. However, in the 1980s, this was the site of one of the most remarkable tales of gurus, cults, and feverish extremism that the US has ever seen. It is a story of astonishing devotion, a mini-city that rose from the desert with power struggles, electoral battles, attempted murder, and even bioterrorism. The rapid rise and fall of Rajneeshpuram is a tale so outlandish, so far-fetched, that it's difficult to believe that it happened at all. But happened, it absolutely did. So let's dive into it. So today's story begins with one man, born Chandra Mohan Jain, later known as Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh or Osho. He was born in 1931 in Madhya Pradesh state in India, one of 11 siblings, but he lived with his grandparents from birth until he was 8. Rajneesh was a gifted but often problematic student at school, a fine debater who even at a young age began railing against organized religion and instead took a keen interest in ways to expand consciousness, including breath control, yogic exercises, meditation, fasting, the occult, and hypnosis. At 21, after studying philosophy at university, he experienced a spiritual epiphany. He began traveling throughout India, spreading his rather unique brand of thought that included greater openness to sex, a hybrid of capitalism and socialism that can only be described as having your cake and eating it too, and personal development. He became popular with many and deeply unpopular with even more. Calling Gandhi a masochist reactionary who worshipped poverty, well, probably did help things. In 1974, he and his followers purchased a property in Pune and established an ashram that would eventually draw people from all over the world. It held an array of teaching seminars and experimental therapy sessions that often included violence or sexual encounters between participants. It wasn't long before the press began running negative stories about what the sex guru, as they called Rajneesh, was promoting in Pune. By the early 1980s, the ashram was bursting at the seams, with around 30,000 visitors passing through its gates each year. This was coupled with an increasingly hostile India that saw Rajneesh's practices as borderline heretic. In May 1980, a Hindu fundamentalist by the name of Vilas Tupe attempted to kill Rajneesh. Enough was enough. Rajneesh ordered his secretary, a wily young woman named Ma Anand Sheila, to find a property outside of India. A few months later, she returned and announced that she found the perfect spot, the big muddy ranch just outside of the small Oregon town of Antelope. At the time, Antelope was already a shadow of what it had been, but in truth, it had always been a dusty backwater settlement with very little going on. Originally a station on the Wagon Road connecting the Dalles on the Columbian River with the gold mines near Canyon City, the town's population peaked at 1,900 by the late 19th century, but went into free fall throughout the 20th. By 1981, less than 100 people lived in Antelope. Sheila had chosen a sprawling 64,000-acre site that was purchased for $5.75 million. That's about $18.5 million today. There were no roads, no buildings. There was nothing. But that wasn't the case for very long at all. Followers began arriving from India and other parts of the world in July 1981 and immediately set about constructing what quickly became a remarkably self-sufficient mini-city, then named Rancho Rajneesh. Now, imagine the grizzled ranchers who lived in and around Antelope as they witnessed this unfold. Oregon was well on its way to becoming one of the more liberal states in the Union, but the area around Antelope remained conservative and old-fashioned. Suddenly, then, you find your small city inundated with strange hippie types dressed entirely in orange who seem to be floating through the world in a bubble of serenity. Were they high? Had they been brainwashed? What on earth were these people up to? Remember, this was just 3 years after 909 people died at the Jonestown commune in Guyana, though through either suicide or what we'll kindly describe as assisted suicide. There was a real fear in the air regarding cults, and suddenly, one was right on your doorstep. A month later, Rajneesh himself arrived, not in a simple automobile that one might expect from a spiritual leader, but in the back of a gleaming Rolls-Royce. He was greeted by roughly 3,000 followers, who were then calling themselves sannyasins, in a manner one might expect royalty to be met. Now, if you could say one thing about followers of cults or religious sects: they tend to work pretty damn hard. There's no grumbling about hours or overtime or pay, they simply get on with it. What rose from the Oregon landscape at the Rancho Rajneesh was mighty impressive. Within 3 years, the sannyasins had built housing to accommodate 7,000 people, a fire department, police, restaurant, malls, townhouses, a 4,200-foot, that's 1,300-meter airstrip, a public transport system using buses, a sewage reclamation plant, a reservoir, a post office with the zip code of 97741. They had, quite simply, built an entire city from scratch. It wasn't exactly the small agricultural community they'd first claimed, but that was just the start of the tensions with the local people that eventually exploded. But we'll be coming to that shortly. From what we know from those who lived in the commune in the early 1980s, life was pretty good. The sannyasins were filled with a sense of purpose that few had ever had. They believed they were building the hallowed utopia, often promised but never delivered. As word spread, the population increased quickly. We're not entirely sure how many people lived there at its peak, and it's long been speculated that the sannyasins may have hidden beds when official inspectors were on the property. Likely the figure reached close to 10,000 at its peak, but almost from the get-go, trouble was brewing. It would be a stretch to say that the sannyasins were welcomed into the area, but there was at least a begrudging acceptance in the early stages. And that shred of goodwill began to evaporate as more and more sannyasins poured into the town, and once the Thousand Friends of Oregon, a private non-profit organization that advocates for land use planning, got involved, things started really heating up. The sannyasins had purchased several properties in Antelope itself, a shop and a post office to begin with, but had plans to build a large distribution center. However, business permits for this were quickly blocked. Unsurprisingly, this infuriated the sannyasin leadership, and intimidation and aggression soon followed, with rumors of an impending takeover through legal means. In April 1982, the inhabitants of Antelope made the astonishing decision to try to disincorporate itself, which would have effectively ended its life as a city. However, by that point, their numbers paled compared to the newly registered sannyasins, who not only voted down the measure, but also eventually won a vote to rename Antelope as Rajneesh. This may have seemed a glorious triumph to the sannyasins, but in reality, it was the start of the downward spiral. The descent into mayhem and violence was not all down to the sannyasins. Almost since their arrival, there had been a steadily growing nasty undercurrent of scare tactics rippling through Oregon and further afield. This was not simply negative press and published letters spouting all kinds of bitterness towards the newcomers. Pictures of sannyasins, including Rajneesh, began to appear as targets at gun clubs and turkey shoots. They were often referred to as red vermin or red rats. The atmosphere was turning pretty toxic, and it was only a matter of time until something happened. In the early hours of the 29th of July 1983, 3 pipe bombs exploded at the Hotel Rajneesh in Portland, a property owned by the sannyasins, reportedly set by Islamist militant group Jamaat ul-Fuqra. But one of the 2 people injured at the scene was Stephen Paul Pastor, a Jamaat member who had blown off part of his hand while setting explosives. He was later sentenced to 20 years imprisonment for his role in the attack, but the entire episode remains strangely murky. There's never been any established motive for the attack, but if it was meant to kick the hornet's nest, it absolutely worked. Almost overnight, the sannyasins ramped up security in and around the commune. Visitors were now greeted by the Rajneeshpuram Peace Force along with semi-automatic weapons, and guards remained close to Rajneesh whenever he spoke in public. And then their spiritual leader stopped speaking in public entirely, engaging in one of his multi-year periods of silence, with followers only able to communicate with him through the increasingly erratic Sheila. By late 1983, there was a growing sense of unease within Rajneeshpuram. Many doubted that Sheila was accurately relaying Rajneesh's messages, and resented a growing autocratic role in the commune. As the fear of AIDS swept the nation, their leader proclaimed that 2/3 of humanity would die of the disease in the coming years, and a proclamation was passed that anybody having sex must wear rubber gloves and a condom while doing so, and also refrain from kissing. The free love of the early years was quickly disappearing. As Rajneesh became increasingly withdrawn, rumors emerged that he wasn't well. At the time, Sheila claimed that he was taking 60 milligrams of Valium each day alongside copious amounts of nitrous oxide. So, Rajneesh ended his period of silence in early 1984, but it immediately became clear that the gaps were appearing between the group's leader and the leadership group just under him, in particular Sheila. In one report, he may have even called her a fascist and likened her to Hitler in the way that she'd been running Rajneeshpuram. If he was shocked by that, what came next would have blown his mind. With the November 1984 county election looming, the Sannyasins set out an ambitious plan. Their goal was to win 2 of 3 seats on the Wasco County Commission, as well as the sheriff's office. But to do this, they needed 2 things: more votes for their candidates and dramatically fewer votes for their opponents. The first part of this plan involved busing homeless people from around the country to Rajneeshpuram. They'd then smarten them up and get them registered to vote. Now, this sounds callous to the highest degree, but many ex-sannyasins have continued to extol the virtues of this plan because it allowed many to start new lives. On the other hand, you suddenly have hundreds of previously homeless inhabitants in Rajneeshpuram, many of whom suffered from mental health issues and addictions. It may have, in theory, boosted the voter turnout, but it did little to restore harmony. The second part of the plan was horrifying to the extreme. The commune leadership planned to sicken and incapacitate voters in the Darles, the largest city in Wasco County, by spreading salmonella in restaurants. After purchasing the bacteria from a medical supply company in Seattle, staff cultured it in labs within the commune. In September and October of 1984, the Sannyasins contaminated the salad bars of 10 local restaurants, infecting 751 people. While nobody died in the attack, 45 people received hospital treatment. It later emerged that a second attack had been planned on Election Day, but was shelved. Residents of Wasco County immediately suspected the group of the attack and turned out in droves to beat the Sannyasin candidate. Ultimately, though, it didn't matter. All the homeless people brought to Rajneeshpuram were barred from voting anyway, leading to the group withdrawing their candidate. Initially, investigators blamed poor hygiene at the restaurants as the cause of the outbreak, and the Sannyasin link didn't fully emerge until the commune had imploded, but it remains the first confirmed chemical or biological terrorist attack in US history. Then, on the 14th of September 1985, Sheila and 15 to 20 other top officials abruptly left Rajneeshpuram. The following week, at a press conference, Rajneesh formally accused Sheila of a litany of crimes, including the salmonella attack, the attempted murder of his personal physician, wiretapping, bugging, arson, and the poisoning of 2 public officials who had visited Rajneeshpuram. An extensive criminal investigation got underway. The group that had fled the commune splintered, and Sheila hightailed it to Europe later that month, but was arrested in West Germany in October and eventually extradited back to the United States. She was sentenced to 3 20-year terms in federal prison, later reduced to 4.5 years, which she served concurrently. A slightly shorter sentence was handed down to Diane Yvonne Anang, also known as Ma Anand Pooja, nurse practitioner and secretary-treasurer of the Rajneesh Medical Corporation. On the 23rd of October 1985, a federal grand jury indicted Rajneesh and several other disciples with conspiracy to evade immigration laws. 4 days later, he was arrested at Charlotte Airport while attempting to flee the country aboard 2 jets with a group of his followers. Despite the catalogue of crimes committed by the Sannyasin leadership, Rajneesh was never implicated in any of them. Instead, he was charged with 35 counts of deliberate violation of immigration laws. As part of an agreement, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of making false statements to immigration officials. Rajneesh received a 10-year suspended sentence, a fine of $400,000, and was deported and barred from re-entering the United States for 5 years. He died in India on the 19th of January 1990 of heart failure, but his teachings and mantras continue to be read around the world, and his books are available in more than 60 languages. This was also when the commune effectively collapsed. By the end of October 1985, the small city of Rajneeshpuram, which had risen at a breathtaking speed out of the Oregon desert, was completely deserted. The Sannyasins left in all directions. Some found other communes to join, others chose to reintegrate into a more traditional society. While it's easy to characterize this whole episode as theocratic lunacy that went too far, it's worth pointing out that the vast majority of those who lived in Rajneeshpuram still speak about it in glowing terms. There's no question that the leadership descended into manic absurdity, but for the everyday man, woman, and child who resided there, it was a peaceful utopia that many claim changed their lives dramatically for the better. Cults and communes, well, they rarely work, but their core often begins as something good and proper, before usually unraveling thanks to the various complex oddities that all humans share. Today, Antelope is once again a sleepy town. Its population was 37 at the last census in 2020. Walking through the peaceful streets, you'd have absolutely no idea this had once been the scene of one of the most extraordinary tales in US history. It was a titanic struggle between a small conservative town populated mainly by ranchers and those with a long history in the area, and the religious commune that originated in India. The only mention of the incident you'll find in Antelope is one with a plaque attached to the post office. It reads, "Dedicated to those of this community who, throughout the Rajneesh invasion and occupation of 1981 to 1985, remained, resisted, and remembered. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing."